if you load your rifle right, and if you fix your bayonet so, and if you kill that man, my friend, the one they call the foe. And if you do it often, lad, and if you do it right, you'll be a hero overnight. You'll save your country from a plight. Remember, God is always right. If you survive to see the sight, a friend now greeting foe. No, you won't believe in it anymore. It's an illusion.
It's night in South Vietnam, a bright moon. Phase 2 of Operation Gary Owen. And a large enemy force, as many as 1,000 soldiers of the battle-hardened D4 45th Viet Cong Battalion and supporting units are on the move down Highway 328. 3 scouts casually stroll ahead of the main body of the force. Waiting for them, in ambush, at the huge gates to an abandoned, otherwise unremarkable village in the Australian area of responsibility, is a combined armour infantry force, heavily outnumbered. The combined force is commanded by Armoured Corps Captain Tom Arrowsmith of B Squadron, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. The infantry contingent, the 2nd Defence and Employment Platoon, or Second D E Platoon for short, is led by a formidable former English Marine, Corporal James B. Riddle. No officer is assigned to the platoon, nor has it got a platoon sergeant, a radio operator, or a medic. An inexplicable lapse of normal military procedure when it comes to infantry operations. The force is also operating outside the range of Australian artillery, unaware that intelligence reports have confirmed that a large enemy force was heading that way. What will take place that night would normally be celebrated as a great Australian military success in the best traditions of the Australian Anzacs. It very quickly becomes the source of military intrigue, soured by questions about failed administration by task force senior officers, sordid actions, blatant deceit, and the corruption of historical accounts. Not long after the ambush, the infantry platoon will be disbanded, and all trace of it erased from the records of the war, effectively making it a ghost platoon. This is the story of why that happened, and of the veteran who stared down the military bureaucracies, fighting to have the ghost platoon reinstated into the historical military records of the nation, a former private soldier who served in that platoon, Don Tate. Imagine for a second that you were a young man who went to the Vietnam War at the age of 19 to serve his country, doing the most dangerous task of a soldier, being a rifleman. He serves across 4 different units over the next 8 months, always in the field and always as an infantryman. There are no black marks against his name, no AWOL, no drinking, no fighting, no insubordination, no accidental discharges, no failure to do what was required of him. He never let any man down. With the last unit he serves in, the 9th Battalion, he gets badly wounded, running into enemy machine gun fire to assist the 1st section of his platoon, which has come under heavy machine gun fire from a large Viet Cong bunker complex. His right hip is shattered by a bullet. He is repatriated home to Australia and spends the next 2 years in military and repatriation hospitals. He eventually gets discharged, medically unfit with a permanent disability, He is no longer of use to the army. He signs the discharge papers half naked, still wearing a full-body plaster cast. The army hands him a 30-day rail pass that he'll never use in gratitude for his service. But he's going nowhere in that condition. A long period of hospitalisation has affected him psychologically and will do for the rest of his life. He struggles to walk again and rehabilitate, finds himself unemployed and uneducated, and has no job skills other than for killing people. Then, fast forward 40 years, and one day that soldier learns that the unit he was wounded with, the 9th Battalion, has no record of his name on its roll. If that wasn't devastating enough, he also learns that another unit he served in during those 8 months, the Second D E Platoon, or the Ghost Platoon as it's now called in veteran circles, has been erased altogether from the historical records of the war. He is unaware of it at first, but he has been the victim of gross deceit by the very institution he served in Vietnam. His service history has been corrupted along with the service histories of every man who served in that same Ghost Platoon with him. That young man, now a veteran, finds himself in a no-man's land. He doesn't have the tools to verify his war service, is too insignificant to tackle the red hats of the army or the pseudo-military institutions, and is vilified by fellow veterans as a wannabe. Don Tate's story is also a part of the Ghost Platoon story, how he dared stare down the gatekeepers of the national military history to validate the existence of the platoon. It is also a story of manifest betrayal of all those who served in it.
Let me be clear about one thing. I'm an Anzac and damn proud of it. For 4 months in Vietnam I served with the 4th Battalion, or more precisely the 4th Royal Australian Regiment, which had 2 companies of New Zealanders attached to it, making it officially an Anzac battalion. I'm also proud to have served in the Vietnam War, regardless of what the Army did to me afterwards, because there were many men of my generation who either weren't inclined to do so or who didn't have the heart for it. But when I volunteered for the Army, I believed it was a bastion of honour and integrity, and that there was nothing more noble than fighting for country. But what I learned, and learned the hard way, is that the Army is not as honourable as one might think it is. While it seeks to promote the image of the Anzac soldiers as bronze, courageous larrikin, it's quite prepared to cast that ethos aside, along with military honour and truth if need be, simply to protect the officer ranks. And men of lower rank, men like me, infantry privates, can be easily cast aside. The fact is, what was done to me and others I fought alongside in this Ghost Platoon was reprehensible, and in my case, particularly despicable, because I was just one of 2% of men who was actually physically wounded in the war engaging the enemy. At that point I was serving in my last unit, the 9th Battalion. So I spent the last 55 years of my life significantly disabled. For me, the war has never seemed to end. 20 operations, long periods of hospitalisation, rehabilitation and recuperation.
And I take it and hopefully crack it. Here she goes. There it goes. Straighten his leg up. So we've gone from here, in this position, to that position. And a little bit.
I'm here, Dale. Dr. Stelly's been to see you. You know what you've had done. He wasn't able to give you an assurance that you'd walk better. He thought you'd be worse off, so he's had to do the best option for you.
And the thing is, that night that I was wounded, only the machine gun crew was actually ordered to go forward to bring fire to bear on those bunkers. I simply went with them because that's what I thought an infantryman should have done in those circumstances. The national historian Ashley Eakins was kind enough to mention my actions in his final volume on the war, Fighting to the Finish. He states that I, quote, assaulted into a storm of enemy fire, which was something of an understatement. And I'm not talking about heroism. This was simply a matter of duty. But I paid very dearly for that cavalier run through the jungle mud that night, because it was the last time I'd ever walk like a normal man again. So it's been absolutely gut-wrenching for me to have to prove that I served in that 9th Battalion and then prove I was wounded with them. And on top of that, having to prove that another unit that I served in a month or so earlier wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Correcting my own service history was something I should never have had to do. Now, it's a fair question you might ask, how could this have happened in a modern army? Well, when I was posted to the 9th Battalion, which was my 4th and last posting in those 8 months I was in Vietnam, the lazy orderly room clerks of Charlie Company simply didn't do the paperwork. So when I was wounded just a month or so later and repatriated back to Australia without the paperwork being done, it meant I hadn't officially been signed into the battalion. I wasn't even aware of this for the best part of some 30 years or so, until I raised the issue of this platoon that had disappeared from the records of the war, the Second D E Platoon. And when I raised the subject, it created such a furore within the veteran community here in Australia that my entire service history became a subject of intense scrutiny. And that administrative gap in my service history became a weapon in the hands of some. Why? Because there were those who wanted that particular slice of military history to be kept away from prying eyes. It all became very contentious. What we know now is that that particular platoon, the Second D E Platoon, had been raised in extraordinary circumstances, done without the permission of the Australian government or the High Command in Canberra. For 6 weeks, that platoon carried out significant actions against the Viet Cong, including that contentious ambush on May the 29th, 1969 at Tua Tik. And then it disappeared from the history books just as quickly as it had been formed for reasons we weren't even aware of.
Proving that it even existed, let alone detailing what it got up to, became one of the most divisive matters within the military, the government, and the veteran community at large. And the knives came out for Tate, literally and metaphorically. And the worst thing he could have done was to write a memoir as a former infantry private. Writing books about military things was the domain of generals and prime ministers, don't you know? The jungle green men once wore proudly became the green of envy. So in his 60th year, long after the Vietnam War had ended, Don Tate found himself at war again. There would be blood. What Don Tate didn't know at the time was that the Second D E Platoon, as he calls it, never officially existed. It was an ad hoc platoon made up of some 40 combat veterans from the 4th Battalion who had remained in country when that battalion returned to Australia at the end of its tour. Tate was one of them. The platoon was created for an emergency that was evolving in the Swan Mock region of the Australian Area of Responsibility. The Special Air Service, the SAS, had recorded dozens of enemy soldiers congregating in that region in early May of 1969. One sighting alone, they recorded 172 of them. It was thought that they were most likely forming up for an attack on the provincial capital of Bahria, and the Australians had to take them on. But the commanding officer of the Australian Task Force, Brigadier Cedric Pearson, didn't have an infantry unit at his disposal. He'd already deployed his 3 infantry battalions across the province and didn't trust the SAS for one reason or another, as the national historian pointed out in his History of the War. Too frequently on contact with the enemy, SAS patrols called for rapid extraction, diverting helicopters and manpower from other tasks. For one period, Pearson said, "I had to ban them making contact."
You know, it's a curious thing, but Brigadier Pearson did have another unit at his disposal. It was the generic Defence and Employment Platoon. At that point in Vietnam, was led by a bloke called Lieutenant Ray Woolen, and that was established on the order of battle. But Pearson didn't consider using that because it was essentially made up of men who had been considered unfit to serve in regular battalions for one reason or another, or at least that's what the national historian has to say about that matter. So Brigadier Pearson ordered the creation of a new D&E platoon, the Second D E Platoon. And Major George Pratt, who was the officer commanding headquarter company of the task force at the time, more a desk jockey than actually a leader of men, he was quite happy to oblige. The trouble was, as the Minister for Veteran Affairs, Mr. Bruce Bilson, publicly declared in 2007, there was no authority to create such a platoon. Therefore, it didn't officially exist. It had been created illegally, and any paperwork to do with its creation either wasn't done in the first place by Major Pratt or subsequently erased afterwards to hide the fact that it had been.
That decision to create an illegal platoon set in motion a web of deceit that would have significant consequences for Tate and the other 39 men who served in it. A routine order was placed into the service history of every man who served in that platoon, stating that they had all been posted to the 6th Battalion. This was the first deceit by the Army, a corruption of their records. It was designed to cover the backsides of the officers who had created the platoon. None of the men ever set foot in that battalion. What they were Brigadier Pearson's own personal assault troopers.
So there we found ourselves, a group of men who had come from different companies in the 4th Battalion, who had never fought alongside each other before, in something of a unique first for the Australian infantry. Instead of foot slogging through the jungle and cutting our way through it with machetes and dodging snakes and mines and booby traps, suddenly we were mounted on a troop of armoured personnel carriers, APCs, in the combined force of both armour and infantry. But you know, everything about that platoon was abnormal. The leadership, the structure, the tactics. I mean, you got 40 infantrymen stretched out across 700 or 800 metres sitting on 9 APCs. So the very fundamental aspects of normal infantry organisation went out the window. So for about 3 weeks we were operating, we fought to a tick with mixed results. A few hits and misses. But we even hit a couple of mines at one point or another. It cost one APC driver his leg, and a couple of engineers had their ears burst when one of the mines went off. But the infantry suffered no casualties at all, not for the whole 6 weeks in fact. We put that down to the leadership of Corporal Jim Riddle. You know, we didn't even know what day it was or where we were going, but we ended up with this huge imposing structure, like gates, but to nothing. The village had gone. But where it was a point we learnt later, the brass expected a major confrontation, not that they told us. In retrospect, knowing what we know now, it's not hard to take the view that we lowly infantry privates were simply sacrificial pawns that night, used as bait, if you like, for senior army officers up to chain to score medals. And that's exactly what happened. But setting up our ambush positions that night, we couldn't possibly have known that we were about to confront a large body of enemy that outnumbered us by some 20 to 1 or so. To a tick, it was about to become a killing field.
As far as ambushes are concerned, there was nothing too remarkable about the ambush at Tuatik. It was as successful as it should have been when armour and infantry worked together, especially when you have the element of surprise on your side. Hundreds of enemy soldiers strolled into the armour position at the gates to the village and were met by heavy machine gun fire from 3 of the APCs and a section of the infantry. While another section of the infantry, under the command of Corporal Jim Riddle, opened fire at the column of enemy from their early warning position some 500 metres down the raised dirt road leading to the village. A mortar fired some 20 rounds into the enemy positions. Within minutes, a fixed-wing aircraft known as Spooky, serendipitously positioned at the nearby village of Swan Knock, swept both Australian positions repeatedly, and in truth, probably saved both Australian positions from being overrun.
Well, the next morning we collected, I think it was about 11 bodies or so from both contact points, and we lined them up along the dirt road. It was a bit of a disappointing result when you consider the firepower we did have. But then again, we didn't go too far into the jungle looking for bodies. If you've hit an army the night before and you've only got a few bodies to show for it, well, it's not the sort of place you want to hang around too long under those circumstances. And anyway, we didn't worry too much about body counts. They weren't as important to us as they were to the Americans, who had to keep justifying their presence in the country. In any event, what we learned was that the Viet Cong always dragged their bodies away if they could, and the wounded, because they never wanted to give us a psychological advantage of seeing what damage we'd done. But there was enough blood and body parts in that ambush zone and the tree line to indicate that the enemy had suffered some considerable casualties. Brigadier Cedric Pearson turned up very early by helicopter that next morning to get the glory shot, as men of the ilk are apt to do, but his very presence added to the intrigue about this matter. He had a photograph taken with Captain Tom Arrowsmith, but made no inquiries as to who the infantrymen at the scene were, or bothered looking for our officer. Of course, as task force commander, he would have known exactly who we were. So the next day, we were ordered to take these bodies into Swan Mock for propaganda purposes, show the locals who's boss, that type of thing. But on the way, we got ambushed ourselves by the same unit that we'd hit the night before. The trouble was, they were too close to the APCs, and when they hit us with rocket-propelled grenades, they simply bounced off the hulls of the APCs and exploded harmlessly, which was unfortunate for them, but fortunate for us. If they'd been successful in disabling those APCs with us infantry blokes stretched out so far, about 600 or 700 metres, we'd have been easy meat. As it was though, the Viet Cong left themselves vulnerable. So Arrowsmith orders an immediate counterattack, a herringbone, they call it a herringbone tactic. And all the APCs charged through the jungle, their machine guns blaring, and us infantry blokes holding on for dear life, just trying to hold on, let alone fight the Viet Cong. And then the jungle opened up into this big grassy area, and all you could see was Viet Cong running everywhere and the APCs charging in all directions. It was just absolute madness. Now we found another 5 bodies there, but there are other bodies we know that were crushed underneath the APCs, but again, it's not the sort of place we'd hang around too long counting bodies and searching for them. No siree, we were out of there. They told us later, after we'd been disbanded, that they found in total another 50 graves in that immediate area during the next month or so around those 2 contact points. And I must say that cheered us up considerably. There had been 2 photographers who had been embedded in that platoon which we weren't aware of, Army Sergeant Chris Bellis and civilian photographer Dennis Gibbons, and they were recording everything that went down. And photographs of that mad APC charge with us infantry holding on precariously was splashed across newspapers all across Australia. and two photographs in particular recording the gallantry of the infantry. That was Corporal Elcom and Private Brian Rennie, really demonstrate how difficult that was to do. But those two actions at Tuatik had at least made headlines in Australia, if not the historical accounts. Unfortunately, and this is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to the integrity of after-action army accounts, there was no mention of the infantry involvement in the two actions as far as the official narratives were concerned. All we got was a brief mention in an ABC interview conducted with Captain Tom Arrowsmith the day after the Tuatik ambush, and we described the infantry section as his scouts.
My troop has just been deployed in an ambush position for 48 hours near Tuatik, which is 15 miles east of Nuidat. We went there on a reconnaissance task and to ambush anything that came through the area. We were in ambush position for about 24 hours when at 8:30 the night before last, my scout group, 500 metres down the road from my position, reported there was a large group of enemy approaching our ambush. We all stood to and waited for them to come into the ambush area. When we had the majority in our ambush area, we initiated the ambush using claymore mines and machine guns.
I've got to tell you, it irked us many years later when we learned that because there was no record of the Second D E Platoon anywhere, in any record, the generic D E Platoon took all the credit for those two actions.
Of course, Private Don Tate and his fellow soldiers were blissfully unaware of the military machinations developing behind the scenes. It was way beyond their pay grade. They were given 5 days of rest and recuperation in the port city of Vung Tau. They returned to learn that their Second D E Platoon had been unceremoniously disbanded, and they had all been reposted to other units, although some of the less competent soldiers were retained in HQ Company under Major Pratt. Tate and most others ended up in the 9th Battalion. They then went about the task of soldiering as if nothing untoward had occurred, and never saw each other again. Many years later, Don Tate had become an author, and his memoir, The War Within, outlines certain contentions that occurred at Tuatik after the ambush that stirred up a hornet's nest. Other veterans couldn't reconcile Tate's account of the ambush and the aftermath with the official narratives, either those of the infantry or the Armoured Corps. In fact, the only reference at all, located in the Armoured Corps narratives, mentions only 50 plus Viet Cong had been ambushed. That was the figure Captain Arrowsmith sent through to the task force, but he was only counting the head of the enemy contingent he encountered from the safety of his APC, at his position at the gates. Strangely, he made no mention of the infantry involvement in the ambush whatsoever, and no record appeared in Major Pratt's headquartered company narratives. Tate was called a liar and a fantasist, and a great deal more when veterans also couldn't find his name on the 9th Battalion roll, or any proof of his being wounded with them.
What also happened at that ambush site, and also not recorded in any official narratives, were actions deemed to be a stain on the reputation of the Australian Army. And what we also didn't know was that almost immediately an embarrassed Australian Defence Force had already begun a sanitisation of all the facts regarding that ambush. Photographs taken by the two photographers, as well as movie footage, had landed on the desks of the high brass in Canberra. They weren't pretty, and there was hell to pay.
As early as 1972, Tate had been inquiring into why there was no mention of his service in the Second D E Platoon in his service records. He ran into brick walls.
Platoon's role specifically was to react to immediate intelligence so that it could go wherever it was required on short notice.
You couldn't put a battalion into it, so we were a handy little outfit that you could just very quickly throw at people, and we were very efficient.
But over time, along with other members of that platoon, and with the advent of the internet, the fight to validate the existence of the platoon began. What the veterans of that platoon also weren't aware of was that the Army had done more than just launch a quiet in-country investigation back in Vietnam when those photographs by Bellis and Gibbons appeared. The second act by the Army was to begin the process of disappearing the Second D E Platoon. It wasn't a good look for the task force if some quirky, non-existent platoon had been involved in wrongdoing, and questions were being asked. So first, the routine order referring to the men being posted to the 6th Battalion was quickly replaced by another. Now it stated they had been posted to the HQ company instead, which was more correct, but whoever was responsible for the switch sloppily forgot to remove the earlier document. Not only that, an entry in the official narratives of HQ Company recorded the infantry unit involved in the ambush as the 6th Battalion, clearly an oversight by those cleaning up the mess. Still, the fix was in. At the very same time, Captain Tom Arrowsmith's troop of APCs had been immediately relieved and replaced by a new troop of APCs under the command of a Captain David Lawrence. Lawrence had probably gotten wind of what happened at Tuatik and had little regard for Corporal Riddle or the rest of the infantry. Later, he would report back to Major George Pratt that the men of the 2nd D E Platoon were ill-disciplined animals led by a foul-mouthed mercenary.
The problem was the Australian War Memorial and the Army History Unit both refused to accept that any 2nd D E Platoon had been involved in the ambush or that it even existed, and were adamant that there had been no wrongdoing at Tuatik or elsewhere. There had been acrimonious debate and mudslinging from all sides. So it got to a point where one of the platoon veterans, Edward Colmer, who had a background in federal policing, raised the ante. He put the Australian War Memorial on notice that if it didn't recognise the existence of the 2nd D E Platoon and didn't validate its role in that ambush, he would raise the spectre of atrocities. In an email that he sent to the National Historian, Colmer bluntly asserted that what had happened after the ambush amounted to crimes against humanity and contravened the Geneva Convention. The trouble was, of course, he had no proof. It was his word against the official accounts. Although we'd become aware by now of whispers about some in-house inquiry that was held in Vietnam not long after the ambush and the things that followed. That had been conducted by the officer commanding the Army Corps, Major Ron Rooks.
The results of that inquiry by Rooks never saw the light of day. The military gatekeepers at the War Memorial and the Army History Unit denied any such report even existed. It took an enterprising journalist, Frank Walker of Fairfax Press, to break the impasse. He found a file hidden away in the National Archives with a handwritten report inside marked confidential. It was the long-lost Ron Rooks report, and it was titled Atrocity Allegations, South Vietnam, 3 Cav Regiment. It was a revelation, and now Tate and his mates had the momentum. It not only confirmed what Edward Colmer and the rest of the old soldiers had alleged, it had been the army that had raised the issue themselves back in Vietnam. Not only that, the front cover clearly showed that while Defence had denied its existence for years, it had actually been accessed many times by senior officers of Defence.
Mind you, apparently Major Ron Rooks had only interviewed one person, Captain Tom Arrowsmith. The infantry weren't consulted whatsoever. It was such a web of deceit. I didn't know this at the time, but in 1975, one of the members of the Second D E Platoon, Robert Enright, had been so psychologically impacted by what had gone down at Tuatik that he contacted a national radio station and unloaded. The story also made headlines in the local newspaper. The Army immediately dispatched a high-ranking officer by the name of Major George Pound to speak with Enright. According to Enright, it was a farcical interview, and nothing came of it. But years later we searched for that report. Again, the gatekeeper said they were unaware of any such investigation. But we needed this to prove that this platoon existed. So eventually we located Major George Pound ourselves, who lived in Tasmania, but he was aged now and ailing and had no idea what we were even talking about. But that report too was eventually found in the National Archives and also marked confidential. The Army had buried both the Pound report and the Rooks report, while all the time denying the existence of the Second D E Platoon. But what we learned from those two reports was that the Army had always been well aware that atrocities had occurred, but thought that they'd secured the fort. Personally, until about 2006 or so, I'd been unaware of all this intrigue that was happening behind the scenes, but a single paragraph in a newspaper article in 1985 contained a single quote that I made to a journalist by the name of Mike Cordell that ignited widespread outrage. It concerned my recall of an incident that occurred after that ambush on the way to Swan Mock about a woman and a child who were killed. All they had been doing was collecting grass. It was one of those contentions from the ambush that had never been raised before, and now it resulted in an orgy of vilification from fellow veterans. So, first of all, came the death threats, and hundreds of cowardly posts on offshore websites set up by Army apologists intent on protecting the reputation of the Army. Key figures in the administration of those websites included a former member of the Australian Legal Corps and a convicted pedophile in Queensland. They were untouchable. The Australian Federal Police, which was full of veterans, wouldn't intervene, and nor would politicians. But over time, those responsible for this vilification, despite hiding behind pseudonyms like Spartacus and BB and things like that, were outed one by one, and in most cases turned out to be men of little accomplishment, weak, cowardly keyboard warriors, men who preferred the shadowlands. But they did great damage to us, and some members of the platoon chose to put up the white flag and run for the hills. The well of courage that they had once dipped into when they were in Vietnam had long since dried up. And chief among our protagonists, though, was a bloke called Bob Buick, a former Army sergeant, a darling of defence, following the Battle of Long Tan in 1966. They'd given this bloke a gallantry medal after the battle, despite it being Australia's worst military disaster since World War II. Buick made it clear that the campaign that he and others were waging against us was being orchestrated by the military and the government, and that he was their kingpin, their mouthpiece, doing their bidding. But unfortunately, it didn't end well for Buick, because in return, veterans then savaged him. One, a bloke called Fergus Thompson, a former officer of the Army's legal corps himself, made his opinion of Buick quite public, accusing Buick of war crimes. So Buick quickly withdrew, like he had done at the Battle of Long Tan, and bolted for safer ground. At first, I wasn't fazed by the threats, just big talk mostly from little men. Instead, I doubled down and wrote an article that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald. The editor gave it the title, Courage After Fire. But in that article, for the first time, I made reference to the action of the Second D E Platoon at Two Tick. And this was the first time that action was mentioned in any record or resource anywhere. After my memoir came out, journalists began sniffing the story of this ghost platoon and making inquiries into the alleged wrongdoing at Two Tick. And because I was front and centre at raising the issue and fighting to validate this platoon, I ended up with a target on my back. Journalists doing their due diligence needed to verify my bona fides, though, before pursuing the issues. And this is where the Department of Defence really went on the attack. You see, they had to silence me somehow, and it wasn't very subtle what they did. All they had to do was to throw those journos off, was to deceive them, and deceive them they did. In quick succession, the Central Army Records Office issued various letters and documents that falsely stated my service history. None of them mentioned my service with the 9th Battalion or the Second D E Platoon, or that I'd even been wounded. It reached a point of absolute absurdity, though. One senior Army officer from Central Army Records went so far as to boldly declare that I hadn't even served in Vietnam at all, but in World War II. But if that wasn't absurd enough, the classic was won by another senior officer by the name of Mike Casey from Central Army Records, issued a document stating that I had not been wounded with the 9th Battalion on the 19th of July 1969. So, as you'd expect, journalists abandoned the story as if it was the Black Plague. That blatant deceit was meant to discredit me, and it relied on one single premise. If journalists and veterans accepted that advice from Defence, and they had no reason not to trust it, it meant that I was lying about serving in the 9th Battalion and lying about being wounded. And if I was lying about those two things, then anything I had to say about some mysterious Second D E Platoon, which no one had ever heard of, and some outrageous claims about atrocities it was involved in, had to be lies as well. This was quite an effective ploy by Defence. Yet, and here's the rub, all the time, the proof of my service was right under their very noses and all in the Army's own records. The 9th Battalion's own narrative states that I was wounded in action on the 19th of July. The Army signal that was sent to my father when I was wounded does exactly the same thing. The first page of my hospital records states service with the 9th Battalion and that I was wounded assaulting a bunker complex. Ironically, of all the men who served in the war, all 60,000 of them, I was one of the very few who had carried a Super 8 movie camera with me. And those films clearly showed me in all 4 units that I served in colour. And the Army and the Australian War Memorial had access to those films because in 1996 I donated the originals to the War Memorial as part of the historical record. And they were quite grateful to get them. They were valued at about $80,000 or so. And extracts from those films are actually used in this documentary, and they clearly show me in all the units that I served with.
It's important in that it gives the balance towards, compared to all the other film footage we have. Here we have the soldier's view of his experience in Vietnam.
Despite Don's footage being independently valued at $80,000, he's decided to the archives of the Australian War Memorial.
It's quite rare because he was actually there to fight a war, not to take film footage.
To make matters worse, as the controversy raged in 2006, Australia's most prestigious current affairs magazine, The Bulletin, happened to be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the famous Battle of Long Tan, in which 18 Australians from the 6th Battalion were killed in Vietnam. Instead of using an image of any officer involved in that battle, or any of the other significant veterans who were involved, it chose to put Don Tate on its front cover. Tate hadn't even served in the battalion, and the battle had occurred 3 years before he even set foot in Vietnam. Noses were put out of joint. The editors explained later that Tate's battle with the military bureaucracy to correct the military history in regard to the Second D E Platoon and his own history was an example of the Anzac fighting spirit at its finest. The men of the 6th Battalion were not impressed by the slight. The decisive point in both battles came in 2007, when Australia's biggest newspaper, the Sunday Telegraph, ran a full front-page story concerning the destruction of enemy bodies at Tua Tik. It came just as other veterans of the war were helping the Vietnamese locate bodies of its fallen across the country. Tate used the opportunity to put the pressure back on the Army by declaring they wouldn't be finding any bodies from the ambush because they had all been destroyed. From that point, the Army had nowhere to hide. The truth would out.
Nevertheless, the vilification and threats continued year after year, as did our isolation from the community of veterans. I was stabbed twice in the back walking down the main street of Brisbane in broad daylight in 1999, and then bashed on the National Highway at night exercising a knee replacement. Jim Riddle was also bashed, left senseless, had a stroke, essentially became a vegetable, then was denied citizenship despite having done some 3 tours of Vietnam. He was sent back to England without a war pension from the country that he had served and was entitled to. Very few men fought for him either. We'd rocked the boat, you see. We'd upset our fellow veterans. What had happened on the field was supposed to have stayed on the field. And that's fine for most men who served in that war, whose service records weren't corrupted or tainted. But each of us who served in that platoon had a vested interest in leaving the truth of our services behind for our descendants. We had a right to expect our military histories to be accurate. But battling the military institutions which enjoy this symbiotic relationship with defence was one thing, but battling outraged fellow veterans was altogether another. And I'm talking nasty stuff. There's a vicious, cowardly underbelly within the veteran community that stands in stark contrast to the Anzac image that defence would prefer to portray.
Validating the existence of the Ghost Platoon was still a long way off, though. Invited to appear on the ABC's national television show Q&A, Don Tate publicly challenged the Australian War Memorial about the military discrepancies concerning the Second D E Platoon.
I just said at the beginning that it's a question from someone who lived through a particularly brutal war in Vietnam.
I think the Australian public now is well aware that Australian military history is not written by the men and women who actually fight the battles. Rather, it's put to us or presented to the public by our historians and our armchair generals in a manner to make it more palatable, and also to maintain the ethos of Anzac, as well as the image of the bronzed Aussie digger. Now, the Australian War Memorial routinely sanitises the records of the war and removes and destroys anything that is embarrassing or potentially embarrassing to the Australian government, past or present, and or the military. So my question is this: as a man who fought in that war and who was sorely affected by it, how much faith can the Australian public have in our military history when it is so regularly sanitised and corrupted? In 1998, the Army eventually conceded that yes, I had served with the 9th Battalion and yes, I had been wounded with them, as well as serving in the headquarter company of the task force, under which the Second D E Platoon was a sub-unit. So at least the battle to validate my service with the 9th Battalion and being wounded had been won. But that took me 29 years to prove. Such a disgraceful way to treat a bloke. To the Army's credit, in 2014 I received a formal apology from the Army via a current serving general, a Major General in fact, Fergus McLaughlin. After that, the Department of Veteran Affairs updated the nominal roll and now it's correct in all respects. Well, almost. They still can't call it the Second D E Platoon because 40 years had passed. The best they could do was simply acknowledge that we had served in Major George Pratt's headquarter company as, quote, a discrete infantry group. In 2014, along with a fellow member of the platoon, Ian Ramage, we handed the director of the Australian War Memorial a petition signed by 13,000 Australians of all persuasions who demanded transparency in respect to the Second D E Platoon matter and demanded the release of those documents.
The Australian War Memorial never did release those documents, but Tate maintained pressure. In a concerted national campaign, he used the media to great advantage, securing dozens of newspaper articles about the matter. In quick succession, support came from all directions, including from influential army officers who were appalled at the treatment the veterans were receiving and the corruption of their histories. Brigadiers George Mansford and Neil Weeks, both men of immense stature within the Vietnam veteran community, demanded explanations. Let me say at the very beginning that I am very much appalled at the treatment you have received. Not only in recent times, but the whole sad story of total negligence and questionable leadership you experienced in Vietnam. Your efforts have been very honourable, and you have demonstrated much courage in pursuing recognition and justice for your comrades. You have much to be proud of, in particular your service in Vietnam, and your personal suffering, mental and physical, have been more than most. While Neil Weeks not only publicly supported the men of the Second D E Platoon in his capacity as a retired brigadier, he made representations to Parliament on their behalf. They too came under personal attack. But it was an accidental discovery of an entry in the Engineers' Narratives of all places that was a game changer. It referred to a new D&E platoon undergoing watermanship training on a river near Baria in May 1969. Given that the Army History Unit had maintained that there had always only been one D&E platoon in Vietnam, the revelation that there had really been two shocked the National Historian and the Director of the Australian War Memorial, General Steve Gower. Both had steadfastly held to the view that no second D&E platoon had existed, and if it did, it certainly wasn't at the Tuatik ambush. Soon after, Tate received an email from an anonymous source in the Army's Public Relations Unit, calling himself Septimus Prime, that validated the contentions that had occurred at Tuatik. The email included names of fellow officers from the same unit, as well as details and evidence that only senior Army officers would have had access to, in particular referring to the dragging of bodies behind APCs, and one that had ended up headless. He wrote, "The occurrences, which were documented by Don Tate in his book The War Within, did indeed occur. The incident was common knowledge by all members of the AAPRS. A complete statement of denial was written at that time at the highest level at AHQ, to thwart inquiries from journalists and news organisations should the incident become widespread public knowledge. Lieutenant Colonel Logan oversaw this. The Australian Army deliberately destroyed documentation, falsified documentation, and intimidated witnesses to cover up certain unsavoury acts and atrocities committed by Australian soldiers in the field in South Vietnam. The people of Australia owe Don Tate a huge apology. Those most vocal in shouting him down should be suspected as either stupid, insane, or perhaps part of the cover-up, which has continued far too long."
Yes, it was all falling into place. The manifest deceit by defence was now apparent to everyone. But up to then even, the major players in the matter had stayed mute, including Captain Tom Arrowsmith. But proving that the Ghost Platoon wasn't a Ghost Platoon at all, as far as the War Memorial was concerned, still eluded us. It wasn't until two senior Army officers who had been intimately involved with the Second D E Platoon finally came out of hiding and publicly declared what they knew about the platoon. The first was from Major George Pratt, the officer who'd been commanding Headquarter Company in 1969, who confirmed that yes, he had created the Second D E Platoon. And that was followed very quickly by a statement from a Major Barry Parkin, who had actually led the Second D E Platoon for about the first week or so of its existence, before he got us lost one day and we had to be brought in by flares. and he was relieved of that duty, and that's when Corporal Jim Riddle assumed command.
The saga surrounding the Ghost Platoon had many tangents and impacted many people. Not the least of which was the murder of Lieutenant Bob Convery in the 9th Battalion lines late in 1969. The self-confessed murderer was Private Peter Allen, formerly a member of the Second D E Platoon before it was disbanded. Private Allen was clearly suffering shell shock, or PTSD as it's now called, due to the trauma he experienced at the ambush at Tuatik months earlier. He'd been at the listening post with Corporal Riddle's section, and that infantry section had found itself in the most precarious situation, situated a long way from the protection of Arrowsmith's APCs, and given the size of the enemy force in front of it, very vulnerable when it initiated contact. The fact was, Allen's mental state was obvious to all members of the Second D E Platoon, well before that ambush. But at his court-martial, Allen couldn't use that psychological condition as an excuse or a defence, because officially there was no record of the platoon involved in that ambush at Tuatik, or even that he was involved in the ambush at all, if it did. Private Allen was subsequently found guilty and spent a decade doing hard labour in a Tasmanian prison. Historians are quick to argue that first-hand accounts from those directly involved are the most reliable sources when it comes to recording history, not the accounts written by armchair generals or historians themselves who weren't there. It is inconceivable, then, that the personal narratives provided by soldiers of the Second D E Platoon were not only ignored, but derided for so long by those responsible for the integrity of the nation's military history. The sun was quickly decomposing the dead bodies. Along with the dead, numerous blood trails led back from the grass into the jungle. It was decided to take 5 bodies and hang them by the ankles from the back of the APC carriers. Before leaving the ambush site, we had one more task to perform: dispose of the other 6 bodies, which were dragged into an old bomb crater. Along with the bodies, we placed plastic explosives, hand grenades, a number of claymore mines, gallons of petrol, and a long fuse cord. About 5 minutes later, the explosion of our crude burial could be heard. I never looked back. In 2009, Richard Bigwood provided a stat deck to the Australian Federal Police about his role in the atrocities. The Australian Federal Police concluded that while atrocities had occurred, they were at the low end of the atrocity scale. The photograph showing shocked Vietnamese villagers watching headless corpses being dragged into their village outraged Army headquarters in Canberra, precipitating serious conversations at the highest level of government and the military. The Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Major General Stuart Graham, wrote that the photograph could cause immeasurable harm to the image of Australian soldiers. On the 12th of August 1969, Brigadier Pearson issued a revised unit guide to the Geneva Convention at all levels to treat enemy dead with the respect due to a human being. Tate, who refused to take any backward steps, then confronted his former task force commander, Brigadier Cedric Pearson, at an Anzac Day march in 2007, demanding that Pearson offer some explanation of what had transpired with the Second D E Platoon back in Vietnam all those years ago. Pearson had remained silent while the debate and controversy over the Ghost Platoon swirled around him, and was affronted by the confrontation. But 3 weeks later, aware of the commotion and noting the momentum his former soldiers had created, he sent Tate a letter that detailed the creation of the platoon and referred to them as his assault troopers. The group, who were unofficially termed the Second D E Platoon, did conduct themselves with distinction when used with a cavalry troop, the modern term would be assault troopers, in the Swan Mock area in late May 1969. Soon after, the Army History Unit had no choice but to publicly acknowledge that a Second D E Platoon had been operating, after denying it for 3 years. On the 29th of May 2008, exactly 39 years to the day after the events at Tuatik, and just after Don Tate's memoir, The War Within, was released, the whole Second D E Platoon saga came to a close. A local parliamentarian from Tate's electorate, Jenny George, intervened. Although she was ideologically opposed politically to that of Tate, she gave him the opportunity to present the case for the Second D E Platoon's return to the military history. Impressed and convinced by the weight of evidence provided, she referred the matter to Parliament, and the federal government had no choice but to capitulate. In an announcement from Parliament House, the Minister for Defence Material, the Honourable Mike Kelly MP, formally declared in a written statement that the platoon did indeed exist and engaged in a series of important actions in Vietnam as part of the Australian Task Force. I would like to pay particular tribute to the courage and dedication of the men of the Second D E Platoon. The action for which the Second D E Platoon should particularly be noted for was the successful ambush they executed together with 2 Troop B Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment in May 1969 at Tua Tik. This was a ferocious battle that involved the engaged troops taking on a much larger enemy force beyond artillery support, and through many heroic individual and collective efforts were able to soundly defeat the enemy without loss. In 2011, after denying the existence of the Second D E Platoon for 3 years, and after the government had officially acknowledged the existence of the Second D E Platoon, the national historian Ashley Eakins published the final volume of his trilogy on the Vietnam War, titled Fighting to the Finish. While he devoted some 7 pages to the ambush at Tua Tik, including the photographs taken by Bellis and Gibbons, which were always within the Australian War Memorial's photograph collection, Eakins defiantly still only referred to the infantry platoon involved as the D E Platoon.
When I first moved to the area and met Don, who, as you know, is a man of great passion and great conviction, and he never takes no for an answer. So he's the kind of person who is never deterred. And 7 years later, Don, finally, we're all gathered together to unveil this beautiful memorial.
Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero, but there are millions who want to be civilians. Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero, but there are millions who want to be civilians. Come and take my eldest son, show him how to shoot a gun, wipe his eyes if he starts to cry when the bullets fly. Give him a rifle, take his hoe, show him a field where he can go to lay his body down and die without asking why. Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero. There are millions who want to be civilians. Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero. but there are millions who wanna be civilians. Sticks and stones can break your bones, even names can hurt you, but the thing that hurts the most is when a man deserts you. Don't you think it's time to weed the leaders that no longer lead? From the people of the land would like to see their sons again. Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero, but there are millions who want to be civilians. Soldiers who want to be heroes number practically zero, but there are millions who want to be civilians. God, if men could only see the lesson taught by history, that all the singers of the Psalms cannot right a single wrong. Let all men of goodwill stay in the fields they have to till.